Okay, well, here we are again. Welcome to the next iteration of the Wealth Optimizer training series. Today we're actually going to be talking about ratios and how they can help you and your clients make money. The reason that we're going through this pretty in depth today is because all of these ratios are going to be built into the Wealth Optimizer tool calculator. You're going to see them as outputs, and it's important that you understand what's going into them as inputs and how they're being calculated so that when you see them coming out on the backside, you're like, okay, I wonder how this is calculated. I wonder what it means. And most importantly, what kind of decisions am I making or am I recommending that my clients take? And so these are going to be really good as we go through. There's some really cool stuff I'm going to talk about in terms of vacancy and how to manage that and how to really improve your property management business to help your clients make more money. So here we go. So the 10,000 foot view, we're going to be looking at cap rate, expense ratio, the vacancy rate, turnover rate, break-even ratio, and maintenance reserve. All right, so let's talk about cap rate. Cap rate is essentially a short version of capitalization rate. It's what it takes to attract money into the real estate market. So you have to think about that. There's always a tension of who gets the money, right? There's a limited amount of money in the world, and where does that money go? Well, the money's always looking for a return. Okay, it could go to the stock market, it could go to the bond market, it could go to private equity funds, it could go to business, or it could go to real estate. And so capitalization rate is one of the measures we use to say, okay, what does it take to attract money into my local market to buy real estate, a specific asset class of real estate? The other thing it does is it doesn't really take financing into account. And so that's something to really keep in mind. It's a way that we can compare this property A to property B without worrying about what the underlying financing is. Was it paid in cash? Did we have 20% down, 5% down, 50% down? Was it a 20, 10, 15-year mortgage? Was it, a 3% interest rate, a 20% interest rate? None of that matters when we're talking about cap rate. So we have to understand what it does and what it doesn't do. Okay? Now let's talk about how cap rate is developed. You essentially have three different pieces of the cap rate. You have NOI, value, and the cap rate. And if you remember, NOI we talked about was net operating income. Net operating income results from gross income minus expenses. So expenses would be management fees, property tax, insurance, maintenance would be the big ones. Not equity and not interest. Okay? That'd be the financing portion. What we want to look at is strictly income minus expenses is NOI, okay? And there's essentially three different calculations. You can solve for one or another, and just by flipping things around. But here are the three if you need to use them. So once in a while in our business, we'll hear people talking and tell us, they'll come to us and say, hey, I want to buy some property, but listen, I don't want anything that's less than a 10 cap. I've heard that numerous times, and I'm always like, okay, first of all, it was like, what does that even mean? So we'll talk about what it means, and then we'll talk about, is that a legitimate request? I don't know. It might be, it might not be, but let's determine what we're talking about here. So if someone says, I want a 10 cap, let's take an example property. In this case, we've got an NOI of 5,000, right? Income minus expense, 5,000 is what's left. That 5,000 is going to have to pay for the financing and hopefully a little bit of profit. If the cap rate is 10%, what we do is we take the NOI divided by the cap rate, do the simple math, and we get $50,000. $50,000 is what we can pay for this property. Essentially what it means is we're willing to pay $50,000 for that $5,000 income stream. And cap rate is the measure of that payment. All right? So I'm willing to pay $50,000 in trade for a $5,000 income stream. It doesn't matter how I paid for it. I could finance it. I could pay cash. That's not important. That's what we're saying. $50,000 for 5. And so how do we determine what a cap rate is? Well, ultimately, cap rate is set by the market, and it's set by your local market. So I'm going to talk about Sioux Falls because that's where I'm at. I know what the data is. You're going to have your own market, and you're going to have to do the research. You're going to have to come up with what are the cap rates. Cap rates change. What they are in 2016 and 17 and 2018 is going to be different. It's also going to it's going to be different based upon asset classes. So commercial space, whether it be retail or office, it's going to be different from multifamily. It's going to be different from single family. Those will all have their own cap rates. even types of multifamily, whether it's an A, B, or C class property, are going to have different cap rates. Okay, so here's what it looks like on the national level. On the multifamily side, 5.5% is the national average. Office, 6.7%, and retail, 6.6%. On the Sioux Falls side, which we're going to talk about here shortly, is multifamily is ranging anywhere between 6.5 and 7.75. And this was in 2017. We don't know what 2018 is because I'm recording this in 2018, and we're not done with the end of the year. The only way we can know what these rates are is based upon sales. So a property has to sell, and then we know that this is what the market is willing to pay for that income stream. Office, 7 to 8.25, and retail, 6.5 to 8.5. Why you're going to see it in a range is because it's never going to be one number, right? It's going to be in a range of numbers because not every property is going to sell exactly at a set cap rate. It's going to move around. So this is what I would do is find, maybe you've got a company in town that'll do this. Maybe there's another real estate company that's doing this. But essentially what you have to do in your market is figure out what are the comparable sales for the stuff that you're looking at. Okay, so in this case, we've got some multifamilies. I've got 3 different examples here. You got Benson Village Townhomes, 4.9 million, 54 units. It's built in 2013, and it sold for a 7.13 cap rate. And of course, we could figure out what the NOI was, all right, by doing the math. The next one, we got Diplomat Apartments, sold for 1.9 million with a cap rate of 6.25. And then we got Western Park Apartments, $4 million sale, 64 units, sold for about a 6.5 cap. So that's how we establish what the cap rate was in 2017. Okay? So if we think about our buyer, right? He's come to us and he says, hey, I want to buy something, but I'll only buy it if it's got a 10 cap or better. We can say, hey, invite him into our office and say, let's talk about that for a minute. Okay? Is that a realistic expectation? Well, let's think about it. If it only takes a 7 cap to get investors to pull the trigger, is our client that's sitting across the desk from us, is he ever going to get a deal done? Probably not, right? Because here's what's going to happen. This is what he wants to do. For that $5,000 net operating income, that NOI, for a 10 cap, he's only willing to pay $50,000 for that property, for that income stream. But guess what? Everybody else in the market is willing to pull the trigger at a 7 cap. So what that means is they're willing to pay $71,500 for that exact same property, that exact same NOI, that exact same income stream. Well, which one is the seller going to sell at? Is he going to give it to your client for 50, or is he going to give it to somebody else for 71? Well, you all know the answer to that. And so this is how we can educate our investors and say, listen, I get it, you want a 10 cap. But right now, in Sioux Falls, that's not what properties are trading for. They're trading at 7. So if you want to buy something in Sioux Falls, you're going to have to be a little more aggressive. You're going to have to pay a little bit more for that income stream because everybody else is paying more, right? Just like the stock market. You could say, hey, listen, I want to buy an Apple stock for $100. But a seller wants to sell it for $200. Well, guess what? Are you going to be able to buy it for $100 if you can't find anybody that wants to sell it for less than $200? You can't. So what do? Well, hey, I'll pay you $150. Seller's like, no, I'm not selling for anything less than $200. Well, I'll come up to $175. At some point, you're going to find a meeting where buyer and seller agree to make the deal. At that point, that's the market price for that stock. Same thing here. The cap rate is essentially what the market, what investors in that local market are going to pay for the income stream. And it's going to be different. It's going to be different by market. It's going to be different by property type. It's going to be different by the time of year and the year we're talking about. Interest rates are going to affect it. Vacancy rates are going to affect it. So the question is then, how can we get a 10 cap? So I've got sellers or realtors that say, hey, this property's got a 10 cap. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Properties are selling for 7 cap in Sioux Falls. How in the world are you getting a 10 cap? Well, here's how they do it. 1, reduce your expenses, right? If you reduce your expenses, what happens to your NOI? Well, it goes up. A bigger NOI means either you can reduce the cap rate or increase the purchase price, sale price. Or we can increase income, right? If we raise the rents. What we'll see happen, and I think we're going to talk about that next class, is, right, you're collecting this much in rent, but the seller will say, well, you probably could collect this much. And so we're going to sell you the property based upon what I think you could collect. Well, that's going to adjust, quote unquote, the pro forma cap rate, but that's not a real number, right? And so we got to be careful as we're buying property, how people are fudging these cap rates based upon actuals or pro formas, because I can make anything look good on a pro forma, right? I can make it sing. I can make it tell you whatever you want it to tell you because I control the inputs. Actuals much harder to control the inputs, right? It is what it is. The other thing, of course, you can reduce the sales or purchase price and get a 10 cap, all right? So how do we use this? So let's talk about cap rate and interest rate. One of the rules of thumb that we like to use is that the cap rate should be 1 to 1.5% greater than the interest rate. So if interest rates are running around 5.5% right now, then cap rate needs to be 6.5 to 7%. And the reason being is we need the property to be producing enough cash to be able to support that interest rate. So think about it this way. If the cap rate is your boat, the interest rate is your cargo. If your cargo weighs more than your boat can carry, your boat will sink. All right? Think about it that way. So you've got a 7% cap rate filled with a 5.5% interest rate, okay, it'll float. But what happens if interest rates pop up to say 10%? 10% with a 7 cap, that's going to sink the property. Okay, because you've got to have enough additional revenue, NOI, to support that additional pressure of the interest rate. So let's talk about how appreciation happens in multifamily, right? Last class we talked about how appreciation happened. We looked back to the future. We went forward and backward 30 years at a time. We looked at the housing price index. The housing price index is essentially the government's tracking of sales, right? Almost like a cap rate, of sales over time, okay? So this particular property sold for this, and then that property sold for more next year, okay? Now we see inflation or appreciation. Well, in multifamily, where the housing price index doesn't apply, because that's not what it's tracking. It's tracking homeowner sales, single-family homeowner sales. And we're talking about duplexes, fourplexes, or large multifamily. Well, let's see, how does appreciation happen then in multifamily? Well, it happens when the NOI increases. That's the only way it happens. So let's look at this as an example. If we purchase a property for $1 million with a 7 cap, the NOI, by calculation, will be $70,000, right? Income less expenses equals the NOI, $70,000. If our rents go up by $10,000, that adds to our NOI. Let's say our expenses don't go up. So our NOI becomes from $70,000 to $80,000. And the cap rate then adjusts to 8%. Okay, that's one way we could do it. But if it still is only taking 7% cap rate to attract money into the market, right? People are still willing to pay at a 7 cap, then the value of the property actually adjusts to $1,143,000. So a $10,000 annual increase in rents results in $143,000 appreciation. That's how appreciation happens in multifamily. That's how it happens in rental property. Okay? That's different than single-family homes. Single-family homes are kind of being pushed around by other aspects of the economy, right? The natural course of inflation. But here, inflation is still happening, right? Inflation is happening on the rent side in this case, but that's how the appreciation gets built into it. We're going to come back to that here in a second, but first I want to introduce you to another ratio called an expense ratio. Expense ratio is very simply how much of the income is being spent to operate the property. Okay, again, we're not talking about financing. Simply management fees, maintenance, taxes, property taxes, and I think I said maintenance already, utilities, insurance. So it doesn't include financing, and it should be somewhere between 35 and 50% depending on the age of the property, the condition of the property. What happens if you start spending more than half of your income on expenses? There's not enough money left to, one, finance the property, to pay the mortgage, the principal and the interest, and there's no profit for the owner. The farther down you get, closer to 35, the more profitable that property becomes. Now, there's a point at which, if you get too low, right, you're not keeping the property up. You maybe don't have it insured well enough, right? There's limits to what can actually happen. You have to manage the property, whether you do it yourself as a owner or you hire real property management to do it. There's still a cost to collecting rent and taking care of the accounting and everything else that goes with it. So expense ratio, the amount of the income that's being spent to operate the property, should not go over 50%. So let's look at how expense ratio and appreciation work together. So this is kind of interesting. Let's start with an example. We got our income at 100,000 and our expenses at 50,000. So our NOI, right, 100 minus 50 is 50,000, $50,000 NOI. Our expense ratio then is 50%. Okay, really easy math. We're spending half of our income on expenses, which leaves us with half the income left. Now, we're going to increase our income and our expense by 4%, right? Inflation. Rents go up, maintenance goes up, taxes go up, insurance goes up, everything goes up. And if we increase both the income and the expense side by 4%, watch what happens. So our new income goes up by 4,000. Our new expense goes up by 2,000, which means our NOI is 52,000. Our expense ratio is still 50%. We're still spending half on expenses. Watch what happens. If our old NOI was 50,000, at a 7 cap, the value of this property was $714,000. Okay, and you can do the math on this if you like. But now with our new NOI, it becomes 52,000. At a 7 cap, the value of the property now is $742,000, $43,000. And again, doing the math, the difference between 714 and 742 is, lo and behold, 4% appreciation. So if rents go up and expenses go up by the same amount, the value of the building also goes up by the same amount. That's interesting. If we want greater appreciation, right, if we could get maybe rents to go up by 5% and expenses only to go up by 3%, now we're really starting to cruise. Okay, so managing the property, being able to push rents, control expenses, definitely not only adds to cash flow, which is what everybody's looking at, but it super adds to appreciation, right? The value of our property is increasing the better we manage it. Okay, so we're going to jump into the first case study. I'm going to go through this with you. Again, pause the recording, and then I'll come back and unpack it for you. So in this case, we want to calculate the cap rate if the rent is $10,000 a month and expenses are $4,000 a month. Now, keep in mind that cap rate's always calculated on an annual basis. So obviously, one of the first things we're going to want to do is we're going to want to turn this into an annualized amount. Our purchase price is $1,110,000. So go ahead, stop the recording, and we will see you on the other side. Okay, we're back. Let's go through this with you. So the first thing we want to do is we want to figure out what our NOI is by month. Well, let's take $10,000 income, subtract our $4,000 expenses, which leaves us with $6,000 per month NOI. Now, we said we want to look at it on an annual basis. So let's go ahead and multiply our monthly NOI by 12, which gives us $72,000 per year NOI. The next thing we want to do is figure out the cap rate. So we have to use one of our calculations. I was doing the math here. So we're going to take our $72,000 and divide that by the purchase price. And if we do the math on that, that equals essentially 6.48%, right, or 6.5% cap rate. So fairly simple to figure out the cap rate. It's a really quick calculation, but that's how you do it on this one, 6.5% cap rate. Okay, we're going to take the same property. We're going to look at case study number 2. We're going to look at the power of improvements and what that does for us. Yes, improvements are a cash intensive thing, but what does an improvement do for us? So this case study, after this purchase, our investor does $100,000 in improvements, which allows her to increase her rent by $1,000 per month. So we want to know what her new cap rate was. Okay, so go ahead and pause it, and we will see you in a second. Okay, we're back. let me walk you through this. So our first rent was $10,000 a month, but we added an extra $1,000 per month, right? So now our rent is $11,000 in rent. Our expenses were still $4,000. Our expenses didn't go up. And so our new rent amount, or our new NOI amount, is $7,000 per month. Take that times 12, gives us $84,000 NOI. Now the question is, what's our input cost? So we purchased the property for $1,110,000, but we also put in another $100,000 into the cost of the property. And so our input is essentially $1,210,000. Okay, and we want to divide that by 84,000, our NOI, which is going to equal, and if you do the math, it's going to equal a 6.9% cap rate. But there's another way to do this, okay? The next part of this case study is, let's look at what is her new value, okay? The question is her new value just $100,000, the $100,000 that she added to the property? Maybe she did new toilets, and new siding, new doors, new roof, whatever it was to improve the value of the property. Is that it, or is there something more there? So go ahead, let's figure out with a cap rate of 6.5, because remember, she just bought the property at 6.5%. That means that she could probably sell that property again for 6.5% in the same location, the same time. All right, now if it was 5 years later, different story. But she just turned right around, made the improvements, upped the rent by $1,000 a month. Cap rate's essentially the same. What's the new value? So go ahead and pause it, and I will get ready to show you how I work through this in a minute. Okay, we're back. Let's look at how we figure out this new value. So we have 11,000 is income again, minus the 4,000 in expenses, leaves us with 7,000 NOI times, or we'll do times 12 is 84,000, right? So that hasn't changed. Now, we said, let's go back to that 6.5% cap rate because we could trade that at 6.5%. Let's do 84,000 divided by 6.5%. What does that equal? Well, that equals the 1,292,307. Well, you notice how that is different from 1.1 million plus the $100,000 improvements. Okay, let's look at that next slide. So here's what happened. Purchase price was 1.1 million. We just calculated the new value at 1,292,000 based upon the then current cap rates in that market. So that tells us with, if we just take the difference between these two, her increased value was 182,000. Now, she put improvements of 100,000 in, so that was her investment to get 182 out, right, in value. So by definition, her value has increased over her investment by 82,000. That's her return on investment. Her investment was 100. She gets all her 100 back in value plus an additional 82,000. So take your 82,000 divided by your initial investment. That's a return on improvements or a return on investment on the improvements of 82%. Now, that's not a cash return, right? She put $100,000 in cash to get $182,000 back. But that's an improvement on value. Her value has increased, so $100,000 in, $182,000 back in value, that's a really nice return on investment. And that's how properties, when they're maybe a B or a C class property, somebody will take them, turn them, and the value, boom, pops up. And then that's the flip opportunity in a multifamily space. And this could take 1 to 2 years sometimes by the time you move tenants out, rehab the units, bring tenants back in at the higher rent rate. But that's where the value lies in rehabbing multifamilies. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is vacancy, which we call the silent killer. What's interesting about vacancy is that so many property owners don't see it. It's silent, right? There's no complaining tenant. There's nobody, saying my furnace doesn't work and the neighbor's dog is barking. None of that's happening, and yet it's so insidious. There's just all this money just draining out of the property. And as property managers, we know this, right? But it doesn't hurt to explain that to people as we're going through teaching them about vacancy. And set it up and say, hey, listen, a new furnace costs $3,500. It lasts about 25 years. You spread that out, it's about $140 a year. Same with a water heater. Maybe that's about $114 a year. A roof, right? $267 a year. But vacancy at a $1,000 property, 5% is $600 a year. 8% vacancy rate in the city, $960 a year, right? Vacancy could be the number one single most expensive expense they're going to have, and they don't even know it. Right? It just sits there and leaks out. It's like their bucket's got holes in it, and the money's just draining away. Okay? One of the things that's going to be really important as you set up your version of Wealth Optimizer tool is you got to figure out what your city vacancy rates are. And it's even helpful to look at it as a trend. Okay? There's going to be somebody in town that's tracking this. Ours is coming from the South Dakota Multi-Housing Association. They send out a survey twice a year to all the property managers in town and say, okay, how many units do you have? How many are vacant? They kind of look at zip codes, different areas of town, that sort of thing, and kind of say, hey, this side of town has a higher vacancy rate than this side of town. Overall, here's what it is. They'll look at market rate apartments versus subsidized apartments. But here is the market rate apartments in Sioux Falls. So the blue line is US average. You can kind of see it hovers around 6%, popped up to about 8% there during the recession in 2009, and then it's been around 4%, 4-5% from there. But Sioux Falls, notice how the local market is a lot more choppy, and my guess is you're going to see that in your market too. There's going to be great years, there's going to be poor years. You can see up during July of 2009, 14%. That was the recession, right? And now we're seeing, look at what's happening here, January 2018. I don't have the July number. July number here has come down a little bit. But we're seeing this steady increase of vacancy in our market. Well, what's going on? Again, your market's going to be different, but I was able to find this chart from a nonprofit organization that had put a study together looking at affordable housing in our city. And our city is only 250,000 people. So if you live in a bigger city, there's going to be a lot more data for you. Smaller city, probably less data. But in this thing, what I like to show during class is look at what happens here. We've got, in the red, we have multi-unit family construction. And you're like, well, I deal with single family. That's okay. But the multi-unit thing, right, it's apartments. It's supply that renters are using up. And they're either going to be in a multifamily or a single family. But the point is, a rising tide raises all ships, right? And so even if we're not in multifamily, it's still going to affect us on the single family side. So look what happens. Red is the multifamily construction rate, so building permits. The blue or purple is the vacancy rate. Watch what happens. 2000, 2001, spike in building, followed by an increasing vacancy rate. Well, an increasing vacancy rate is like pump the brakes on building. So the building slows down. Building slows down, vacancy rate comes back down. Boom, kick the building back up. Spikes the vacancy rate. Of course, this is the recession, so that's a little bit odd. Shut the building down though, right? Nobody's building new units. Coming out of the recession, build. No response to the vacancy rate. This study was done in 2016. We kind of fall off the map here, but if we go back, if we were sitting in 2016, what would we expect that vacancy rate to do in 2017 and 18, which is where we're standing today? It's a no-brainer, right? I mean, a child can practically see, hey, listen, there's a really good chance that vacancy rate is going to go up. It's not coming down. It's quite low here anyway at 4%. It's probably going up. And sure enough, what do we see? Here's 2016. Here's 2018, right? Vacancy rate has responded to that building, and the building, quite frankly, has not really slowed down all that much. So what this slide shows you is kind of what the building permits have been historically, and it's something that you should look at in your own city because it's going to kind of inform supply and demand, right? This is the demand side. So as you see this happen, you can kind of predict a little bit depending upon population trends. So looking at a census data would also be helpful. But here you see in 2015 about 1,700 building permits. And just because they're a building permit doesn't necessarily mean it got built, of course, right? That's always a possibility. But of course, if it's down that far and you're pulling a permit, you're probably going to be building it. 2016, 2,600 permits, and then 2017, 2,400 permits. 2018, it's backed off a little bit because vacancy rates have been so high. People are starting to pump the brakes on development. The next thing I want to show you is what is a standard market cycle chart, right? You can plot any market on a chart like this. It essentially has 4 different phases. You've got expansion, where you have the growth happening. So in real estate, it'd be building. Building permits is what's driving the expansion of the market. You have hyper supply, where the supply is outstripping demand, right? You don't have enough people moving into town, swallowing up or gobbling up those additional units. Then you have a period of time where people pump the brakes on building, right? And lets the population catch up. You end up with a recession. Prices are going to come down in terms of the properties. Rent's probably going to stagnate a bit. But once that happens, the people keep moving in, having kids. At some point, there's going to be a bigger demand, and you're going to end up with a recovery. And then expansion is going to be, well, we've got all this demand, rents are coming up, vacancy rates are low, let's build some more product, right? And that supply and demand is going to happen over time as long as the governments or other people don't interfere with the market. It's going to have this up and down effect, right? It's the natural progression of a free market. And so you can kind of see in Sioux Falls how Bender Commercial, quite frankly, has plotted this. So in 2014, they're saying, hey, we're at the height of the expansion. We got hyper supply happening in 15 and 16 and into 17, right? We're seeing that's when those vacancy rates are increasing. That's an indication of too much supply for how many people we have. And so we don't know exactly when this is going to happen, but in 2018, we're looking at a recession, 2019 and 20. These are opportunities for purchases, right? Properties are probably going to come on sale. Vacancy is high. So what happens when vacancy is high? The NOI decreases, right? Because you got all this vacancy. The gross rent number isn't there. And so the value of the properties are going to decrease with that increased vacancy. And so that's the opportunity to snap them up, to buy them, is during this recessionary period. And then, of course, that's going to turn around, and then rents will increase and will recover, and people will start building again. So understanding the ebbs and flows of the market helps the timing of getting in and getting out. And understand this happens over many years. This isn't like a, this week, next week sort of thing. This is a year, several years, even decade-long cycle. All right, the next thing I want to jump into is a conversation surrounding vacancy rate and turnover rate. And this is one of those conversations where often when I introduce it to somebody, at first they'll disagree with me, they'll argue with me, say, no, you've got this all wrong. And the thing is, I didn't get this out of a book, right? This is something I was sitting in my office puzzling over vacancy rate and doing calculations and trying to understand the effect it had, the city had upon our portfolio, and what could we do about it. And I kind of stumbled on this a little bit by accident. So here we go. I'm going to explain this probably a little bit slower and go over it a couple of times because I want you guys to really understand it, because it really affects the kind of moves you can make, the offers you can make into the market. And so it's important that you get this. All right, so let's talk about how many days of vacancy do we have based upon a vacancy rate. So what does vacancy rate mean? Well, vacancy rate essentially is how many days or how many properties were vacant in a given period of time. So if we look at an 8% vacancy rate on a single property, if we say that property was vacant 8% of the time, we know it's vacant for 29 days out of the year. And how do we know that? Well, it's a simple calculation of 365 days times 8%. And if we do that, it's 29.2 days. Okay, and we can do the math for any vacancy rate we want. But 8% is of 365 days, 8% of the year is 29 days out of the year. It's essentially, why 8%, why pick 8%? Well, it's a month, right? That's essentially a month. A full month is 8.33% vacancy for calculation purposes. So that's the first data point that we have. 8% vacancy equals 29 days. Now, let's take this one step further. We could look at 100 properties, right? We can look at a portfolio, a vacancy rate over a portfolio. We could look at a vacancy rate over a multi-unit building. We could look at it on your portfolio of all your properties. We could look at it for single family versus multifamily. We could look at the entire city. We could look at it over the entire United States, right? So it depends on what subset of data we're looking at. And it doesn't matter, but in this particular example, to illustrate the point, we're going to look at 100 units. So we have a fictional portfolio of 100 units, and its vacancy rate, on average, for the entire year is 8%, okay? So what that means is if we know that one property that's 8% vacant is vacant for 29 days, that means, by extension, right, if this is one property right here, one unit or one property, if I have 100 units, how many days vacant? Well, of course, we move our decimal point 2, so we end up with 2920, or 2,900 if we round it. 2,900 days of total vacancy. If that seems a lot to you, it's surprising, right? It's like, wow, I didn't realize that 100 properties have that much. The other thing is immediately somebody's going to jump up and say, hey, wait a minute. Not every property goes vacant. Okay, well, that's true, right? We know that. We know that some properties are going to stay occupied 100% of the time. We know that some people are going to renew. Some people have a 3-year lease. They don't move out. Some go month to month, and the property never goes vacant for 29 days out of the year. So what does that mean? It's the same difference, right? What we're saying here is that if we take a measurement at any point in time, take you Friday at 2 o'clock, it's 8%, right? Thursday at 5 o'clock, still 8%. Let's even go back and look at the Sioux Falls chart. What we're looking at, and normally we're not measuring vacancy rates, on an hour-by-hour, day-by-day basis. They're taking 2 measurements, July and January. That's all we've got. So we've got to extrapolate the rest. But if I look between, say, July of 2012 and, say, I don't know, July of 2015, it's running around 4% average. And I could pick any particular day in there. It might be 4.2, 4.5, 3.5, right? Every single day, or if I took my imaginary portfolio of 100 units, this says that any given day, 8 of those units are vacant. Now, it's not the same units. And it doesn't mean that every day is going to have 8 units vacant. It could be on Monday I have 9, then I rent one, I've got 8. Then on Friday I have another one, rent another one, so I only have 7 vacant. But then 2 more people move out on Sunday and I have 9 vacant again. I could have 10 vacant, I could have 3 vacant, I could have 15 vacant. The point is that on average, if I took every single day, on average I'd end up with 8 units vacant every single day for 365 days out of the year. Okay, which results in the $2,900 day number on a 100-unit portfolio. So hopefully I've said that several different ways so that you can kind of get the concept of what 8% vacancy means. It doesn't mean that all properties are going to go vacant 8% of the time. It means on average, the portfolio is 8% vacant. Okay? Let's look at the next concept. Let's look at turnover rate. So turnover rate has to do with the question of how many units go vacant during the year. How many actually turn over? How many do we move a tenant out, do a move-out inspection, show the property, find a new tenant, and move them back in? That's a turnover. How many of those turn over every year? Well, the best data I could find says that about 54% of properties, of rentals, turn over every year. It's less when you get to subsidized. So subsidized housing, Section 8, tax credit housing, those will run about 35% turnover, right? The population is a little more stable. It's older people. They're getting paid by the government. They just stay in place longer. Market rate apartments, about 54%. That could be different depending on the time of maybe if it's 2016, 17 or 18, it could change depending on the type of property, right? You could have a different turnover rate for single family versus multifamily. I get all that. The average, though, nationally is 54%. Another maybe anecdotal piece of evidence is as we've managed larger multifamily properties, 180, 330 unit properties, it seems like we have to replace about half the tenants. So if it's a 300 unit building, we're going to have to find 150 new tenants this year. Okay? At some point in time, 150 of those units are going to turn over on a 300 unit building. It's a 50% turnover rate. Okay. So here's what that means. Let's take turnover rate and combine it with vacancy. So of the 46 units, sorry, I want to use black here. The 46 units that did not turn over, how many days vacant did they have? Well, 0, right? They had 0 days vacant because they never had a turnover, never had a tenant leave. The 54 units that did turn over, how many days were they vacant? So if this is units. Well, they had all 2,900 days, right, at an 8% vacancy rate. So what we have to do is we have to divide the total amount of days that were vacant, divide that by the number of units that actually turned over, which will tell us how many days the turnover units were vacant. That's an interesting number. And what we find, if we do the math, it's 53.7%, or sorry, 53.7 days. The 54% is kind of a little bit of a coincidence. So let's look at what the actual calculation. So here's what the formula is. Vacancy rate times 365 days divided by the turnover rate, okay, equals the days vacant for every turnover. So at 7% times 365 divided by the 54% turnover rate equals 47 days. So that means every time a property turns over at a 7% vacancy rate in that market, in that portfolio, in your portfolio, doesn't matter, it's 47 days vacant between the new tenant moving out and the old tenant moving out, new tenant paying rent. 8% is 54 days, and 14%, the reason I picked 14, of course, was because that was the height of our vacancy rate in Sioux Falls. When those properties went vacant, the vacancy lasted 95 days. So what do we do with that? Well, once I realized that this is what was happening, I realized that turnover is incredibly important, right? If we can reduce turnover, what if we could get our turnover rate from 54% down to 50%? Or 45%, or 40%. What if we could keep our tenants happy? What if we could do things for them to keep them in place for longer? That's money in the bank for our owners, right? When we're talking about Wealth Optimizer, this is the big promise of Wealth Optimizer, is we're going to help you manage your property in such a way as to create wealth for you. Managing vacancy and turnover cost is a huge piece of that, okay? And understanding what it is costing our owners when somebody turns over is a huge piece of that. So what we did is we developed an infographic, and this is, I'll just walk you through it real quick, but try to explain this concept. So how many dollars are lost when a tenant moves out? That's the question we ask. When I created this, it was in 2017. The vacancy rate in that case was 7.2%. We know that 1 out of 2 tenants will leave every year with a 54% yearly turnover. And if you do the math, that actually means that the average tenant stay is about 18 months or 1.5 years. And I don't want to get into that, but the math will bear that out. So what that tells us is that if for every turnover, we know that there's about 47 days vacant on a 7% vacancy. That means on a $1,000 rent, if that's what our average monthly rent is, that vacancy, that turnover is going to cost our owner $1,500 in lost revenue. Okay, we know that based on math. This isn't, maybe our vacancy doesn't, maybe we can get our turns faster than that, but that's the national average. I will talk about how we can improve our numbers. On top of that, we know that when a tenant turns over, we got to pay for advertising. We got a leasing fee to pay to real property management. We've got to pay for snow or lawn removal while the tenant's not there on a single family. Cleaning and repair, right? There's things we don't have to do when the tenant's in place. Like we're not going to have to probably paint the walls or replace the carpet or do those type of things that the tenant moves out. We're going to have to do in order to attract a new tenant. And then utilities, right? We're paying to keep the water and the gas and the lights and everything on so that the contractors can do their work, and also that the showings can go on, right? You can't have it ice cold in the property in the wintertime. Got to keep the heat on. So here's the total that's lost to the additional services during the turn, $2,100. So add that all up, the total lost for each tenant that moves out, nearly $3,700 on a $1,000 a month rent property. This is shocking to owners, shocking, right? And yet you can see how this happens, how expensive turnover is. So does this number do anything, right? What kind of actions can we take on this? I'll just finish this out. So then our call to action is learn how to reduce lost money when a tenant moves out, call real property management. Well, sure. What things? Do you think that now when we talk to the owner, say, Mr. Owner, that fridge is out, we really need to replace that fridge, do you think you might want to do it quickly so we can keep that tenant happy so they stay? You got to replace the fridge anyway. Let's get it done right away, okay? Maybe, sending them a Christmas gift, sending them notes of appreciation, doing the things to keep tenants happy pays dividends, right? The property that we're filming in right now, Greystone Heights, we're doing all kinds of things to keep tenants engaged, building a community, potlucks, parties, pool tournaments, paint, wine, and canvas events. We're doing all these things, and obviously that's different than what we can do in a single family. I get that. But the return on investment is the cost of turnover, the cost of vacancy, right? And we're seeing that, and we're saying, what sorts of offers can we make into the market? How do we please tenants, right? They're the customer. They're the reason this property exists. They're the reason any property exists, is for the tenant. Okay, so we've got to take care of the customer. And this is the cost of not taking care of that customer. Now, obviously, some people are going to move, right? They're going to move out because they're buying a house or what have you. So we can't control that. But certainly, we want to keep them in as long as we can. So let's look at additional ways that we're able to use the knowledge of vacancy rate and turnover rate and how we can address the market. So as I was going through this, I was like, I wonder what our turnover days. So if I figured out what the national average is, and I know what multifamily in Sioux Falls is doing, half of them are moving out every year, what is RPM? So we had actually, when I came up with this, we were tracking this over, I think it was about 18 months at that point. And we were looking at when does a tenant stop paying, and when do they start paying, okay? So that's kind of our days vacant, our economic days vacant, quite frankly. And we discovered that it was about 37 days vacant. Now that's higher than we want, but that's what it was over that 12-month period. Well, during that same 12-month period, right, the Sioux Falls vacancy and turnover rate was 54 days. So what we discovered was that our portfolio of properties was 17 days less than what the overall market was, which means that we're doing better by 30%. Well, now that's something that we want to tout. That's something we want to broadcast, right? That's something that owners are interested in, right? They'll buy that because of what we're doing. What does that mean in terms of money? Well, if the average rent at that time was $950 per month, and we had a portfolio of about 500 units, that means that any given year, 270 of those units were going to turn over, right? Tenant moves out, new tenant moves in. Well, if we're able to increase the days of rent collected by 17, which is what the math is, that's $538 per turn, just in rent, right? Resulted in our particular portfolio, nearly $150,000 additional rent to our clients. That's Wealth Optimizer, right? That's how we're using these concepts, these tools to help promote the wealth of our clients. And if they make money, what are they going to do? Buy more rental property, right? And we're going to manage more rental property, and our business is going to grow. This is the model. Help other people, and that's going to grow our business. And I would show this slide when I'm teaching the community or realtors, of which we'd have current customers, clients in the room. They'd get to see this, right? And it reaffirms their buying decision as well. Say, hey, I made a good choice going with Real Property Management. The other question I had was, we have been doing lease-only properties for a couple years now, where the managed side, you lease the property, you manage it, you collect rent, you do all of that. The lease-only was we just advertise, qualify, sign a lease, collect the deposit, pass it off to the owner, they take care of it from there. So that's what we mean by lease-only. And I saw just today, actually, there's a new thing on the RPM intranet that describes this. So perfect. But it's called lease-only. We're going to talk about lease-only in a second. Anyway, we were tracking the lease-only days on market as well, or days vacant. Days on market is different, right? Days on market is the day you advertise it to the day you lease it. Days vacant is when did somebody stop paying rent to somebody start paying rent, okay? That's the money you lost. It could take you 30 days to get it leased, but if you only had, 1 day in between move out, move in, no money lost. That's perfect. All right, so in this case, we discovered that these lease-only properties were vacant 11 days longer than our managed properties, right? Managed properties were 37, lease-only days were 48, so that's 11 days. And then I realized, the other thing is I added an extra 7 days for make-ready, because what I realized is lease-only folks, the tenant would move out, they would then clean it and repair it and get it all ready, and then there'd be a weekend, and then they'd be busy, and then they'd have a job, and then they'd have a birthday party, and then by the time they actually got us the keys in the management agreement, it's at least a week later, probably more. So I think I'm being generous here. But I'm counting 48 days from the time that we input the property into our system. So I think, at minimum, there's an extra 18 days on average that lease-only properties were taking to get leased over managed properties. I have theories on why, but we're using the same marketing, the same application, the same lease. Nobody even knows they're lease-only properties, right? I think what happens is these are slower because one, we're not marketing them while they're still occupied, right? Because we're almost always they're giving it to us after they've moved out. In addition, it takes longer to get approvals, right? We have to call the owner and say, hey, Mr. Owner, we got this and this going on, versus managed, we can just move on a lot quicker. And so by definition, 18 days more of vacancy meant $570 lost rent. You had the extra utilities, 106. You had extra snow and lawn, 42. The total lost, on average, per lease up, compared to if they had us manage the property versus just lease it for them, was on average $718. Or, get this, 6.3% of the top line revenue. Okay, now watch what happens. I got this in my hand. So this is what we were charging them for leasing. Our lease only cost was 6.9% of the annual rent. The vacancy cost was, right, lost rent and lost supplies and everything else was 6.3% of the annual rent, which means their total cost of annual rent was 13.2%. Plus they still have to manage the property and the tenant, right? They still got to make those phone calls. Here's what we were charging. Leasing plus management costs was 11% of the annual rent. They're paying 13.2% and they're doing the work. Do you think there might be a value proposition here? Right? I know it took a long time to get to this point, but look at what Wealth Optimizer is able to do for us when we understand what our numbers are doing. Okay, so we just looked at how much money it's costing them for not doing business with us, right? And this is, again, this is just math. This is tracking, this is data, this is extrapolating based on what we're doing. I'm not just pulling this stuff out of my hat. So we're looking at a total loss of $718 or 6.3% of top line revenue. Let me just do the math for you quick a minute. So 718 top line revenue would be 950 times 12, which is I think 11,400. If you divide that, that's 6.3%. Isn't that much increase on top line? We're adding that much to the top line revenue. Well, here's what it looks like based upon those numbers. Our lease only cost was 6.9% of the annual rent. Then the vacancy cost, right, the lost rent and the additional services that they have to pay for, another 6.3%. So the total cost of annual rent, you add these two together and we end up with 13.2%. Plus they still have to manage the property. They got to manage the tenant, they got to manage the property, they got to do the maintenance, they got to collect the rent, they got to do the accounting, they got to do the eviction, they got to do all that stuff. And look what we were charging them. Lease, the other option, the full management option, right? Leasing plus management cost, 11% of the annual rent. So which one do you want? 13.2 or 11%? 13.2 and do all the work, or let us do the work for 11%, okay? Let's go back and look at one other thing. That's the conservative way to look at it, but I want to show you something else. This $718, that's additional value that RPM is bringing to the table. But what is actually the value of that? Well, let me ask you this. What is the NOI on this property? Okay, NOI. Well, if we're saying $950 rent, average rent times 12 was $11,400. Okay, might have to double check my math on that, but I think that's what it was. $11,400. What's the NOI? If we set a 50% expense to income ratio, right? We don't want to go over that, so let's assume that we have a property that's no bigger than 50%. So 50% of 11,004, that's going to be 55, 56, 57. So 5,700 equals the NOI. Sorry, I can't write straight. This is before financing. And let's pretend that this person paid cash, right? It'd be different if they financed it, but let's say they paid cash. So this would be kind of their bottom line number, right? Income minus expenses, bottom line 5,700. Now let's look at 718 in additional revenue, additional cost savings, divided by 5,700, and what do we get? Well, we're going to get nearly 12.5% increase. Now that gets scary, quite frankly. You're meaning to tell me that by virtue of reducing vacancy by 18 days, that we're increasing their bottom line profitability by 12.5%? Most people don't get 12.5% all year, right? And they're not having to do the work. So in terms of selling ourselves short or not valuing our services or finding ways to make money as property manager or selling our property manager business, man, you got to think, when you have data like this, right? And you can explain the value and what it means to them and how I'm going to increase your wealth. Heck, I'm not even charging you what I'm going to bring. I'm going to pay for myself. I'm essentially going to work for free, right? And you're going to get an extra 1.5% on the bottom line. That's a huge offer to bring to someone. Now, doesn't mean they're going to take it, right? Emotion still rules, right? Logic doesn't really matter. It's too much in sales, right? So you have to find the emotional hook because they still have to spend 11%, right? And we're talking about saving 12.5%. At the end of the day, they're going to have that much more wealth, but you got to communicate that somehow. Oops. Okay, 3 more things and then we're done with this class. So the one thing here I want to talk about is ghost or economic vacancy. Ghost vacancy is something I made up. I don't think it actually exists, but it sounds better than economic vacancy. And it's trying to get at this concept that even when, so actual vacancy is when no one is actually in the property. Ghost vacancy or economic vacancy is there is a body in the property, right? But they don't pay rent. It's like they're occupying the space, but there's no rent being paid. And that can happen through a bunch of different ways, but like the inability to pay, job loss, illness, death, or discounts and incentives. So what happens when our vacancy rises in the city? Well, as actual vacancy goes up, landlords get nervous, right? They got to try to get tenants. They got to try to get bodies. They'll start giving stuff away. And so if you think about the dark blue as the actual vacancy, as actual vacancy rises, people residing in a property but not paying for it also rises. And you don't see that number. So even though the Sioux Falls City vacancy rate is 11.5%, I would say ghost vacancy or economic vacancy, where somebody's in the property but not paying, is even higher than that. Cutting into that top line revenue is something fierce. For example, there is properties around town right now that are offering 2 months free, right? You sign a lease, 2 months free. That's 16% of the top line revenue, right? 16%, right? That's all of their profit and then some. They're just trying to get their expenses covered, trying to pay the bank, right? And so as vacancy rates increase, the discounts and incentives also go up, and we're not measuring that. So not only do they have 20% vacancy, they're giving away another 16% to discounts and incentives. That's brutal on the property. And so if we can figure out how to manage that and do better, we will definitely help our clients. Okay, this is the second to last thing, the break-even ratio. You're going to see this on the Wealth Optimizer tool. Break-even ratio essentially means how many units do you have to have occupied and paying rent in order to cover all expenses and all financing. So what's it going to take to be neutral cash flow? So if you said 85% is my break-even ratio, that means 85% of my units have to be occupied, or if it's single family, it has to be occupied 85% of the time in order to cover all my obligations. When you get a higher break-even ratio, so when your break-even ratio starts bumping into that 95, 97, 100%, you can even see break-even ratios of a 101, 102%. What that tells you is that property is negative cash flow. So 102% break-even ratio, obviously I can't get the property to be, unless I start selling, spots in the hallway or put them in the garage or something, I don't know, but you can't get it beyond 100% occupied. So once you're over 100, the investor's going to be putting money into the property out of his pocket every month, okay? So that's the break-even ratio. Last thing I want to talk about is maintenance reserves. You guys are familiar with this in the property management world. We have a reserve on each property. That's not really what this is. This is more about how do you budget for maintenance. Wealth Optimizer, we've kind of played with this. There is a section in there that we'll go through that can get really in depth. You can really lay out like for 30 years where you think your maintenance is going to be. You can also just run by rule of thumb. 2 rules I want to share with you. One is, the most common is to budget maintenance based upon rent. The reason that's done is it's easy and it's a percentage of revenue, right? It's easy to budget. It's easy to calculate. You take your gross rent times 5%, there's what I'm going to spend on maintenance, what I'm going to budget as a pro forma. Even though the property is brand new, you still want to budget something for maintenance. You want to be saving up if possible, and you still have stuff, right? Even a new property has stuff that needs to be repaired and fixed. If it's a good property, 8%. Generally, if I don't know what the property is, I'll figure 8 to 10% on a pro forma. If it's fair, 12 to 15%. If it's poor, it could even be 15 to 20% of the rent. At some point, right? When you get down here, this is hardly repairs anymore. You just got to replace stuff. And this is a piece, just know that this is something that we've wrestled with in Wealth Optimizer. We have not solved it yet. But let's say we put a new deck on a home. Right now, that's going into expenses. And what happens then is your Wealth Optimizer output looks horrible because you just drop $5,000 into the deck, and maybe the cash flow coming out of the property is only $3,000. Well, that's going to look really bad when you go to the owner, but the reality is that's a 20-year investment, right? That just increased the value of the property. Yeah, it cost cash, but you kind of almost have to see it a little bit as a depreciation thing where you take an asset and convert it into expense over time. So that's something that's not been solved in Wealth Optimizer. I'd like to see something happen there, but anyway, know that it's there. Ultimately, what's happening is when you do those replacements, you're actually increasing the value of the property, which increases, based on the cap rate, what you can sell it for. The second rule that you can use, which I think is actually probably more accurate, again, it depends on the property, is a percent of the property value for maintenance. So for example, here 1% or a little bit less would be a good number. So for example, if the property is a $100,000 property, I have to plan on spending $1,000 in maintenance, 1% of the value of the property. Where this becomes really important is when you get to high-end homes, sometimes the rents have nothing to do with the value of the property. For example, we rented a home that was worth about $750,000 for $3,000. Well, really, I mean, you'd want to see for the value of the home, the rent to be about $7,500, right? And it's way down here at $3,000. So in that case, a percent, 8% of $3,000 wouldn't really be enough maintenance for that property. You got multiple furnaces, and you just have a lot of stuff, multiple refrigerators. And so there you're going to kind of want to use a percent of the property. So $750,000 property, figure $7,500 or maybe about $6,000 for maintenance, right? A little bit less than 1%, again, depending on the value. So a couple different rules on how to use the maintenance reserves. Okay, that is the end of what we have for this class. We've got a few more to go, but we're getting through them, and I hope to see you on the other side.